We come today to the last quarter of this year-long inquiry. Its title is the Parayana. It's like paradise, paranormal. It is para, which means beyond, generally above, beyond. It connotates actually going across to the above, beyond. And yana is the Sanskrit for way, the Mahayana, the great way. Not vehicle is sometimes wrongly ascribed to it, but way. So this is the way across to the beyond. And one of the dominant themes running through this year-long inquiry is the appreciation of time forms. And it is the appreciation of time forms that contributes our coming confidence in being able to develop an analytic of civilization, to, for the first time, come to the competence and the ability to have an analytic that resonates with an appreciation, an aesthetic, so that the art and science of civilization, for the very first emergence in time, can be appreciated and analyzed. And this is an important step for us, because our capacities now have not only become super, they have become supercluster super. We are not only leaving the confines of our world, our planet, for other worlds, other planets, in fact, quite rapidly in terms of history, for other star systems. We are leaving the sophisticated species that has been stable for us for 40,000 years to a refinement of species. What was for 160,000 years Homo sapiens transformed 40,000 years ago through art, through the ability to have vision, to enter a vision field, and to have a new dimension of person come through that experience of entering into a fifth dimension vision field, to make a prismatic person that is able to make paintings, to make sculptures, to choreograph a maturation beyond the merely cultural, beyond the merely ritual and myth, yes, and even including symbols, to be able to reach a new quality of understanding, of wisdom, so that Homo sapiens, wisdom man, for 160,000 years, began a transform again, a second transform into Homo sapiens sapiens. So the tradition by now with designation is to repeat sapiens. So it isn't just wise man, but it's wise about being wise. To arrange one's life and persons, one's individuality, one's group, one's culture, one's even society, so that what is encouraged is a further maturation, not just to mature in terms of nature and its cycle, or even taming nature in the form of plants and animals, taming minerals and metals, and finally, fifth, taming themselves to be able to explore, the Homo sapiens sapiens over the last 6,000 years have been entering a third transform. A transform that has taken a number of very large cycles, which are not just cycles, but because consciousness has played the creative, remembering roles in this double transform, that a third transform has become apparent increasingly, while civilization has been going on its double chiral spiraling into a new maturity. Now it is possible for us to understand that we have entered into a refinement of species that best can be designated Homo sapiens stellaris, star wisdom man, man whose home is not a culture or a multicultural world, but it's an entire star system, a stellar civilization. On the frontier of interstellar space and on the frontier of interstellar worlds almost beyond number. One of the problems is to be able to understand what is this cycle which with consciousness has become an ecology. How does the refinement of that ecology accumulate the energy to not only sustain itself, but to mature and mature further? It has become apparent increasingly over the last 6,000 years that the dynamic that occurs has to do with time. And it's only 2,000 years ago that it became apparent to those few who were carrying the energy wave of time, the frequency of its occurrence, that time, in fact, has not only form, but it has forms, which mean that there are analyzable sub-forms, so that one can begin, at least, to understand what is going on in terms of the larger development. Two aspects occurred 2,000 years ago that were paired, like the two hands coming together, the two eyes, the two ears, the symmetry, that there was something to do with the way in which conscious Homo sapiens made a transform of nature all the way through its cycle. Nature itself welcomed this further dimensioning. And it was as if, as one began to understand that the transform of within nature by the field of consciousness could be applied by persons prismatically who were able then to look at what they do with what they have, the ritual actions with the ritual selection of objects, of phenomena, that the phenomena and the actions together made a practice which could be refined and increased, so that ritual itself became refined through this transform. That language, the oral language of communication, which had been developing for quite some long period of time, our neurological and physiological human structure was capable of a very refined language when Homo sapiens first emerged from the tree with all of its branches of primate life, especially the Homo series. Homo neanderthal, for instance, our closest relative on this tree, was physiologically, neurologically not able to speak like we are doing currently. They were limited in the sounds and the sound control. It's in the thoracic region of the spinal column that the complication is not just with the larynx, but its intimate tie with the breathing, so that when I am speaking in the way I am to you, which is perfectly normal and natural for us, I neurologically, like you, are able to modify my breath some 60 times per second, ongoing, in increasing complexity. All of this was not available to even Homo neanderthal. After 160,000 years, when the refinement of the Paleolithic forerunners of civilization came into play with art, there was a different quality that the time of nature began to have an ability to have another quality in it, not quite a second tier, but another quality. As long as language was oral, it could develop, it could mature Homo sapiens up to about 6,350 years ago, where there were very large villages, almost like proto-cities, but there was not yet a civilization. It was like high cultures, very mature and developed. With the development of a written language, about 4350 BC, everything changed. It began a momentum that comes down to our own time, that the refinement of time, forms, and civilization is by the increasing complexity and facility of a written language with a consciousness which is differential in visionary access, which is kaleidoscopic in historical flow, complex flows, so that the art and the science available, refined together, the arts and sciences since the Renaissance, we have always understood. They make a new learning, just in time for 500 years ago, the, quote, discovery of the New World, that there's a whole other half of the world that one can explore, and it turns out to be an inhabited half. Our time is consistently alerted by something that is a subsidiary complement to the carrier wave of these stages of refinement of language, where it begins with a seed, and that seed, those seed persons, that seed time, is a reference wave. And it is extremely difficult because for the first time, as a doctor of civilization, in this work, it is available to refinedly bring a quality of dimensions, which is not only the natural cycle of 4 dimensions or the ecology of consciousness in 4 further dimensions, making an eightfold, but they together form a complementarity, which is a 9th. And that 9th quality is evident in many, many aspects. One of the founders of subatomic physics language was the one who introduced the word quark. And that was Murray Gell-Mann at Caltech, a fellow professor with Richard Feynman. And in his great book on this, with a co-author, it's called the Eightfold Plan for how one comes to the subatomic realization that subatomic particles like protons and neutrons are made up of quarks, and that they cluster together in such a way that they almost never occur individually, they always occur in pairs, but the pairs accept a third. And when the third comes together, when you have three quarks, they come in two massive, important varieties. They come in a positive electromagnetic charge, the proton. They come in a neutral electromagnetic charge, the neutron. And that those neutrons and protons make the atomic nucleus, which has its ability through the proton to attract the electron, which is a negative particle weighing some 1,800 sometimes less than the proton. And yet it is the orbital levels of the electrons that convey the qualities of different elements to the atomic structure which is common to all of them. And it is the interaction of subatomic particles like photons with subatomic particles like electrons that are able to produce the qualities of livingness by which the variety of elements can come together in a very complex, grand, tiered, 8-tiered matrix and produce out of the 92 elements refinements of qualities that are peculiar and particular to each individual element. And when those elements are brought together in such a way that on the atomic level, with the exchange of electrons, they can produce molecules. And it is this way that one begins to understand that we have come to understand not only the atomic structure of species, but the molecular structure of civilization. Our reference wave is about 1650 AD, with Newton and Leibniz especially, but with a concomitant there of developments in China, of developments in Islam, of developments in many areas of the world, that one, for the first time, begins to understand that time forms of civilization are not just the property of those pioneering it and developing it, but that there is a distribution of that energy, which is time, in the space, which is the other three dimensions in nature, and that the spatial distribution in a time sharing is what gives reality as we understand it and live it, its juice and its substance. One of the great difficulties that has emerged in the last 50 years, 100 years preparation, 50 years of refinement, at least as far as my endeavor and concern has been, is that the problem is that regression on a massive scale occurs in clinging to old reference waves when a new carrier wave has been introduced. And the classic case for us is illuminated by 4 qualities of previous reference wave from 1650 to 650 AD. And if you look at 650 AD, the outstanding qualities of that reference wave mature not in the next carrier wave. A whole new reference wave sophistication will be the forerunner of that of the next carrier wave. But the previous reference wave is not a reference wave of carrier waves, but a reference wave of millennia, of a millennium. And this is where the problem of civilization becomes exacerbated beyond control. One has the carrier wave of 650 AD mature about 1000 AD and play itself out. It took about 100 years for it to really come into firm play. By about 1100s AD. But if you look at the way in which the reference wave of 650 occurred, 2 of the most outstanding, powerful aspects of that reference wave, that millennial reference wave, had to do with the birth of Islam and the pinnacle of Chinese civilization. So that in our time, with our carrier wave of 2000 AD, actually the apex of its emergence was 1991. The rejection of the reference wave of mathematization of written language, of calculus, integral and differential, of the way in which a mathematic refines the ability to read and write language which now is a universal language. The language of written mathematics is universal. Refusing that reference wave in preference for the previous reference wave sends us back into a scenario where the millennium plays itself out again like some zombie world view. In Islam, it wasn't just the appearance of Muhammad and the genius of his ability through his life to come to an understanding that there had been a dead end to the Christian revelation in his time, everywhere, a malaise, that indeed had been a transform of the Judaism that went back to, in fact, from 650 AD, where Muhammad was, it went back not just 1,000 years to Alexander the Great, which it did, but went back a second 1,000 years to Moses, to the development of Judaism as a Torah, and that before then was a whole development that had, as the Mosaic understanding of it was, 400 years of slavery that erased everything that was accomplished before, so that one had to redo everything. But for Muhammad, it wasn't that. It was that the previous outstanding figure was not Moses, but was the previous outstanding figure to Jesus, because that had been the big transform. And that figure was Abraham. And so Islam has a great appreciation that they are a part of the inheritance of civilization's dynamic because they are children of Abraham. Not only are they children of Abraham, but understanding that Abraham had more than one wife. It isn't just that he had Hagar, an Egyptian woman who was the maid in waiting to Sarai before she gave birth. Sarah's name was Sarai. It wasn't just that Hagar had the first son of Abraham, Ishmael. And when Sarah gave birth, finally, to Isaac, there was immediately a kind of a challenge that came into play, a divine challenge. Remembered in the Mosaic way as Abraham seeing in a vision that he must sacrifice his son. And so he, living by the Spirit vision, took Isaac out into, it wasn't very far to go into the wilderness, to sacrifice him, to kill him. But he passed the test, and in a bush there was a goat that had entangled itself through its horns into the bush and was bleating, and Abraham understood that he was able to give this animal sacrifice in place of his son. But later, the concourse of that happened to be that Sarah became jealous of Hagar with her older son Ishmael, and finally forced Abraham to send them into exile, into the wilderness, so that Ishmael became literally orphaned in the wilderness. And it was only through the grace of the protection of God that he was able, and the mother, Hagar, to survive. But even further, Islam understands what is only a sentence in Genesis, in the Torah, but is one of the most telling sentences in the entire Old Testament. That Abraham had a second wife, not just a concubine. He had children by her. Her name was Ketubah. She gave him 6 sons. And those 6 sons were not allowed to be a part of the patriarchy, of the inheritance of Abraham, according to the Mosaic Torah. So that the 7 sons of Abraham, other than Isaac, other than the patriarchy, are the founders of the different tribes of what came to Muhammad, of the moment for Islam. We are the inheritors of 7 sons of Abraham. We have a patriarchy which is immense. That particular clinging in the late 20th century, early 21st century, ignores the reference wave of the mathematization of written language, of Newton, of Leibniz, and of many other things, and goes back to the reference wave of 650, but it was the reference wave of the millennium. And so what replays out is not the choreography of the previous reference wave, but what it was a reference wave of. And what replays out graphically, what was happening at the millennium, the preaching of the Crusades, which even that has been completely misunderstood. And in terms of really refinement, has been corrected for almost 2/3 of a century already. The great first mature history of the Crusades was in 3 volumes. The first volume came out in 1951 by Sir Stephen Runciman, who was able to read and write all of the languages, Persian, Arabic, you name it, Greek, a real genius. A History of the Crusades, Volume 1, the First Crusade. Its subtitle is "And the Foundation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem." So that the pivotal hook, it's not just a sticking point, it is a hook. Any kind of bait on that hook that you go for, that hook will catch you. So that Jerusalem is the epicenter of all of the earthquakes happening from a dysfunctional time form understanding and appreciation. But it goes further than that. In the China of 650, the most powerful dynasty of China was being formed, the Tang dynasty. Its founder, his family name was Li, and his given name Shimin, almost like Zimin currently. It's paradoxical. Li Shimin became known as Tang Tai Tsung, the heavenly master of the Tang dynasty. And he was really somebody. He's commemorated, like Alexander the Great, 1,000 years before, of having the greatest war horse of the age. Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, a black stallion that was with him on every military campaign where he was victorious. Tang Tai Tsung, with his war horse, made the war horse the symbol of the Tang dynasty, which reached not just the China that everyone is familiar with, but out past all of the mountain ranges and passes, out past even the origins of the rivers like the Yangtze and the Yellow, reached all the way across the Gobi Desert into what is today Central Asia. And reached all the way down, not just into the wilds and mountains and tribes of South China, but into what is today called Indochina. Was immense. It is that dynastic reference wave that produced a millennium in China. But in the 20th, 21st century, is producing a regression back to this dynastic imperial China to expand itself. And now we have the technical capacity. The whole world is available to us. In fact, the moon and everything else is available to us. We are the new dynasty. We have the example in history. We have the trigger. Let's pull it. Let's get it. Just like Islam, China now is in a deep reference wave regression, but has difficulties because it's not living in the Tang dynasty. We're not living in that glorious, within 40 years of Muhammad, by 670 AD, Islam had spread from the cities of Mecca and Medina to take all of North Africa and to move into the reaches of far Iran, Persian Empire, and within another generation they were in Spain heading to France. They were in Indonesia, heading towards wherever they were going to go. The lure of a grandiose reference wave is that it reproduces almost automatically the millennium, not the new carrier wave. There's more, but that'll be enough until we take our break.